Hello, and welcome back to In Search of Black Power. This is your co-host, Lawrence Grand Prix. I'll be flying solo on this one because this one is a book review of a very important book. So, here in Baltimore, this is the 10-year anniversary of the Baltimore uprising in response to the death of Freddie Gray. This will be 5 years since George Floyd and the uprisings that happened after his death. And in the wake of those conversations, people began to talk about alternative theories of black political leadership, starting really with Trayvon Martin and Ferguson. This idea that a previous generation of black leaders had failed to meet the moment. The Jesse Jacksons of the world showed up when the cameras were rolling and brought folks into a civil rights era form of black political leadership that wasn't up to the task at the times, given the diversity in the black community these folks maybe didn't fully represent. So whether it's black young people, black working class and poor, black trans, black queer, the models of black political leadership that have been given to us by the civil rights movement, the limitations were revealed in the previous decade. And really, for a little over 10 years now, we've had the rise of alternative theories of black political leadership, leaderless movements, and especially movements that sought to center diverse perspectives. And beyond the general idea of it's better to have leaders of different types because there are more people at the table, more ideas at the table, it's important to shape the intellectual genealogy of where these ideas of needing to diversify black political leadership come from, and really evaluate the intellectual perspectives, the questions they raise, the importance of the critique, but also potentially some of the limitations. We're in a moment now after the perceived limited success of so-called Black Lives Matter that some people perceive a backlash to some of these series of new black political leadership that many people feel have not delivered the results that they had hoped. So in this moment, can we look at where these ideas come from to see where we might go next, or maybe even where we went right or where we may have gone wrong? Especially in this moment where, in Baltimore especially, this overdose epidemic has claimed the lives of over 1,000 people a year at its height. There's a text from the 90s that combines a conversation of public health, central topic in the news today, drug use, and black political leadership. This, of course, is The Boundaries of Blackness by Cathy Cohen. In many ways, an essential text in reframing and beginning the seeds of what would really become known to most people as Black Lives Matter. And in this text, not only do we see questions about public health as a center for black leadership connecting to public health institutions and science, we see questions of local black leadership institutions, venerable civil rights institutions being questioned for their commitments to black folks outside of the frame of respectability politics. This is one of the books that really puts respectability politics on the map as a conceptual framework to think about black politics. And by evaluating this book and looking back at it, we can see what many people argue was the need for questioning and challenging the limitations of previous frames of black political leadership. But also we see perhaps some of the limitations that led to some of the perceived limitations of the Black Lives Matter movement. And by evaluating this text, we really hope to respect and honor the need for this text, its central interventions by exposing some of the limitations of black political leadership in New York's response to the AIDS epidemic that disproportionately impacted sex workers and queer folks in that city. But especially as we look into Baltimore now, having its opioid settlement money up for deciding where the money goes, these questions of looking back at necessary critiques of the limitations of the black political leadership in moments around AIDS and the questions around drug use and respectability politics, now we have another round of really needing to look into black communities' relationship to not just drug use, but political leadership narratives in general. And if we really center working class black people as the center of black political leadership, what does that mean for some of the series of intersectional identity politics and centering that this book is seen as presenting, which many people today see as potentially decentering? At least in Baltimore, for example, the main people who are impacted by the overdose epidemic are 45 to 75 poor working class black men. And how do you center those folks while also respecting an intersectional analysis? How do we weigh intersectionality of class versus intersectionality of gender and sexuality? These are some of the questions that by revisiting the boundaries of blackness, we can begin to get a deeper, more fleshed out understanding of and begin to elevate African-centered theories of politics, African-centered theories of gender and sexuality, and African-centered theories of drug use and addiction that show potentially some of the limitations of the approach used in this text, and potentially even the limitations of approaches used by folks operationalizing the theory of black political leadership, the new theory of black political leadership associated with so-called Black Lives Matter. So with that, we want to thank you. Please go to our website, lbsbaltimore.com. Please continue to check out all the great shows here on Black Liberation Media, and I will see you on the other side. So we've already talked about that a little bit, but I think it's important to understand why this book matters and why it's so important and why we're doing a review of it. So in addition to the fact that it touches on many of the topics that we previously touched on this podcast, addiction, public health, black leadership, it's important to understand the context that led the book to be perceived as so important and what fundamentally the work it's doing and the arguments that are stemming from this book that have implications for the political movements that we see today. So, in the traditional view of black political history, many folks, especially before this book, before the rise of alternative historiographies of black political leadership, think about Barbara Ransby's book on Ella Baker and some of the work that comes more into focus in the arts in the 2010s, you have basically a great man's theory of history for black people. So while you have talks about grassroots movements like the Montgomery bus boycott, these are typically seen as appendages of the leadership of individual charismatic black men, often but not always tied to the church. So you have the Mitchells, you have the lobbyist for NAACP called the 101st Senator, but you also have a lot of black church leaders, Martin Luther King, you have Malcolm X, who was the leader of a mosque, you have individual charismatic leaders, even Stokely Carmichael, even though SNCC was intentionally less hierarchical, he oftentimes was lifted up as a charismatic black male leader. And you have a political environment that many people from that generation are receiving some of the benefits of a post-war boom and affirmative action. So in reading this book, I think it's very clear the author is seeing a black political establishment really having established itself really over the past 25, 30 years, because she's writing in the late 90s. So this is really mid-60s up to the late 90s, to the point where this historically marginalized group, this particular sliver of folks tied to institutions like the NAACP and the Urban League, had risen up to have a certain level of material success but also political power. And given that degree of heroic narration of the civil rights movement, having narrated themselves as having this power, the Jesse Jackson campaigns, the rise of local black political leadership, how do you explain the disparate life results from Generation X, the generation that comes after, in the face of deindustrialization, in the face of the loss of manufacturing jobs? It's the beginnings of real conversations of a black political elite hoarding particular benefits of professional access and resources for them, and not producing broad-based advancement, not just for black people in generally, but specifically for people within the black community that are seen as marginalized within the frame of this rising intersectional analysis. So you have the rise of Kimberly Crenshaw in the 80s, the rise of Bell Hooks in the 80s, from the margin to the center, I think it's 85, one of Bell Hooks' first big text framing intersectionality. But you also have in this moment, for example, instances like the confirmation of Clarence Thomas and the debates around Anita Hill and Joe Biden, of course, playing the role of protecting Clarence Thomas, and black men, prominent black men, seen as defending Clarence Thomas because the idea of a black man on the Supreme Court would either produce material benefits for black people or symbolic benefits for black people. And that was seen as this idea of linked fate politics being so tied to an individual black man that you could ignore what he did to a black woman, or the accusations about what he did to a black woman at the time, right? So this really set the context for this text, and the perceived need for this text is in challenging the assumed linkage between this so-called linked fate politics, the idea that black folks have this generally linked fate where the rise of one would mean the rise of the community, and this respectability politics, this idea that someone like Clarence Thomas, or within the context of the civil rights movement, the idea of dressing up and acting with decorum, nonviolent, direct action, framing resistance to the church, framing your resistance within the lens of respectability, cultural norms, upstanding citizenship, will yield positive benefits for the black community. And what the book does is take the analysis of AIDS in general, but specifically responses to AIDS in New York by black institutions and black political leaders from a time frame roughly from 85 up to the mid-90s, really, and use it to challenge this idea of the assumptive logic of linked fate politics being an effective framework for black politics. So at a fundamental level, it just raises the question of intersectionality, where the text says that in many people's eyes in the black community, gay meant inherently white, so therefore AIDS being a gay issue meant that it wasn't really a black issue. And that in and of itself producing this silence and decentering of black gay people who were contracting AIDS through gay sex. Now, of course, one of the other big vectors of AIDS is intravenous drug use. So the text uses the story of black resistance to needle exchange in New York, but also federal resistance to funding needle exchange at the federal level, to make this argument around how do you understand the black community's response to AIDS. And what she argues is that it was first ignored because it didn't fit the conceptual frameworks of blackness, because gayness and drug use was framed out of that conceptual blackness. And then it was folded into a respectability frame where services were offered, but often through the lens of trying to get people clean, getting them off of drugs, rather than a harm reduction frame of basically trying to accept people's drug use as part of their response to themselves and the world, and working with them on their own terms, trying to bring them back into the respectable frame of a sober individual, but also through the frame of genocide, where the black community saw AIDS expanding disproportionately in the black community as a genocidal attack on the black community. And both of those responses, she felt, decenters the specific experiences of black gay people and black intravenous drug users in an attempt to, again, link it within a larger linked fate or respectability politics. The one thing she says is that when they started doing services for AIDS, it was largely through the old vanguard networks of the Urban League and NAACP, basically saying it was strategically useful for them to put the face of a straight black woman in front of the idea of AIDS services, because it basically separated the AIDS work from its notions of being tied to moral deviance with gay sex and intravenous drug use. So this idea of a straight church-going black woman specifically getting the resources to do the work for AIDS outreach, AIDS analysis. And the book grants that they are talking about, some things like cleaning your needles and things like that, but says it's from the lens of it being okay because straight church-going black women are seen as leading it, and institutions like the Urban League and the NAACP are fighting for resources and making arguments around black people should be leading the response to these resources, but from the perspective of the black people specifically being them, this old guard of black institutions who, through linked fate politics, the community had given itself the legitimacy to represent the black community over to them. But they did not represent all of the black community because of this process of what Cohen calls secondary marginalization, where the black community is marginalized, but within the black community itself marginalizes gay folks and drug users from what she calls this sort of indigenous cultural norm of respectability politics. So I think some of the last things I would say is she does a lot of work on media analysis, basically arguing that while the black media does cover some of these things with some more depth. Many in the black media, again, use the genocide frame. Many in the national media follow the white organizations, but don't talk specifically about gay sexuality. They focus a lot on innocent, quote-unquote, victims of AIDS, the children of mothers who are born with AIDS. So there's this innocent victim narrative to decenter talking about the gay sex and intravenous drug use that produces the AIDS epidemic. And she talks about how this has impacts on legislation, where the Black Caucus, though present in conversations around AIDS funding, and sometimes folks like Charlie Rangel arguing to address AIDS, but more from the perspective of genocide. And she talks about how black folks will talk about the reproductive potential of black women being lost because of the deaths of black child-bearing age women to AIDS. And she links that to black nationalist obsessions with reproductive capacities of black women and sort of birthing a new nation. And so they're saying that it's only through the lens of this larger linked fate vision of black nationalism where women as child bearers are seen as valuable, as opposed to specific women and men who are engaged with drug use and gay sex being centered in the analysis. So this is a prime example, to conclude, of the limitations of linked fate politics and the idea the black community can afford to tie its political fate to black political organizations using linked fate analysis. Is one of the central takeaways from this book that became an academic foundation, because if the argument was the real material political implication of the black leadership class having hegemony on black politics was the expansion of the AIDS crisis, then that justifies diversifying black leadership, bringing more working class black queer people into positions of leadership in these political conversations so that they can use their experience of activism and their lived experience relating to people who have this experience of secondary marginalization, that experience allows them to better advocate more comprehensively for the black community. She doesn't say that linked fate politics is inherently flawed. She doesn't say that racism is subordinate to class or gender, but she does say that we have to look beyond linked fate to a future of black politics. So, before I get to some of my analysis of the limitations of this text, because as this text has been so central to the black political movements over the past 10, 15 years that we have raised questions on this channel, in many ways, I think it wouldn't be surprising to many people that we have some analysis of the limitations of this text, especially given some of the work we've said around the public health component. But before that, I do want to talk about some of what I think is the value of this text, or explaining the logic, the political logic within the text, so that we can begin to understand its political series of change and what it saw and why it framed arguments the way it did before we showed the limitations of some of those frames. So I think that in addition to challenging the assumptive logic of linked fate, which I think many of us would agree that, especially along the class component, assuming that black elites and black established institutions inherently advance the interests of working class black people, that's just been proven empirically false. So even raising that question, it's kind of assumed that we'd ask that question now, but the idea of asking that question in the face of a heroic generation of civil rights leaders that really, I just randomly saw Jesse Jackson pop up on A Different World watching the old episodes, and the way the crowd cheered and cheered and cheered after he had lost his campaign to the Democratic primary showed like the deep admiration and respect. So even the basic idea of questioning this assumptive logic of linked fate was not an easy thing per se, and required a sort of specific example like AIDS to really crack open some of the discourse. And in fact, the text is critical of what they see as the limitations of the Jackson campaign's response to AIDS, which is probably better than some in the black community, but in this text didn't go far enough. Secondly, I would say that it made sense to me why the generation that is learning from this text is obsessed with media and narratives. Because in the midst of the AIDS epidemic specifically, the horrible media coverage coming from both the FDA, the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, like the narratives and the silences in the media were deeply impacting flows of research funding and federal support for medications and just federal energy, resource energy in general, was downstream of a lot of misinformation. So this is science. This is something that's complex. Most people don't know science. So especially given the taboo nature of drug use and homosexuality, the media silences and the media caricatures and the stereotypes deployed in the midst of representational politics for this issue were so devastating that this obsession with changing representation and bringing new representative people to speak on behalf of this community, it made a lot of sense because the unique experiences of drug users, even today, it's called Narcotics Anonymous, right? It's not an easy thing to know from the outside what drugs are on the street, what diseases are on the street, what's life like for people who are suffering through chaotic addiction or chaotic substance use disorder. And similarly, communities pushed to the margins. It's not an easy thing to have the knowledge to even know specifically what these folks need. So this idea of lived experience makes a lot of sense, specifically within the context of the examples given in this book. But I think it is the universalization of those theories to larger questions of Black politics where the book starts to fall off. But first, I want to sort of talk about some of the limitations of the text within the context of a few conceptual frames that we've brought up in potentially, I believe, in the past on this podcast, but specifically tie them to the text in of itself. So it's within the context of understanding the text's focus on representational politics that I think my first belief of the limitation of the text comes in. And I'm framing it through the context of Marimba Ani's analysis of rhetorical versus existential politics. The text is deeply critical of the rhetoric, specifically of Black organizations and institutions. Given that it's a text on Black leadership, that makes sense, but I think to the exclusion of the white institutions that had similar rhetoric, that it's not just like a Me Too gotcha thing. It is the white supremacy and the violence that those Black institutions are trying to survive that's injecting that oppression into them. And sort of seeing it as an indigenous expression of Black views sort of chastises the rhetoric of Black folks in a way that is incommensurate with the similar rhetoric of white institutions. But I think it also ignores the existential, ethical examples of care that the book grants were extended even by institutions that she was critical of, in a way that the frustration with the rhetorical silences obscures an understanding of studying how the realities of the care that was provided should be, I think, given a bit more credence and respect. So I think that it is the deep silence of these organizations around same-sex relationships that she feels invalidates and disrespects the humanity of folks of practicing same-sex relationships. But at times, sort of the text uses, like, they're seen as use derogatory slurs and things like that, but there aren't really citations for that. Even the sort of paradigmatic example that I think is very problematic, where the Nation of Islam says, well, maybe homosexuality is God's divine retribution for AIDS is divine retribution for the sin of homosexuality. The way it's talked about, you would think that she would have example after example after example of people saying things like that. But she has exactly one example of an NOI paper stating that statement, and a lot more examples of people talking about AIDS through the perspective of a holistic community genocide. And I think that I'll talk about it more later, but just ignoring the genocide frame and sort of seeing it as deflecting from same-sex relationship ignores the attempt that I believe many people were making to use genocide as a way to push a community that maybe wasn't ready to have a conversation around homosexuality towards caring about people who were deeply suffering. So I think about the example, for example, of E. Patrick Johnson, who was a professor at Northwestern, and his analysis of queer theory, where he talks about having a conservative Southern grandmother who wasn't really able conceptually to fully engage with his same-sex partner. But when she called him on the phone, she would always ask, are you okay? But also, is your roommate okay? Do they need food? Is there anything I can do for them? She wasn't ready to call this person their lover, but the idea of calling him their roommate and extending care along those lines, E. Patrick Johnson sees that as an example of, even in the midst of so-called respectability politics, Black communities are able to extend levels of care to queer folks that should be studied and engaged. And I think similarly, when you talk about the levels of homophobia that are projected onto the Black community, I think most people would think they didn't respond at all. and that the institutions like the Urban League and the NAACP were recalcitrant for years and years and years to do anything. But the book kind of grants that after the silence of the 80s, they actually turned pretty quickly into providing services for queer folks and folks doing HIV and things like that. But that's just seen as co-option of resources from our grassroots organizations, as opposed to these organizations deeply seated, as the book states, in respectability politics, flipping over the course of relatively a few years into actually providing levels of care for folks with AIDS and folks with HIV and folks who are queer. That the question is why? Why did it happen so quickly, given the text analysis of homophobia being so-called an indigenous epidemic within the Black community? But even the text itself acknowledges diversity of perspectives within the Black community. So there's a progressive newspaper, The City Sun, which comments on, the text comments has a far more progressive, challenging ability to cover more of the indigenous activism around the AIDS epidemic. But those things are just kind of given relatively short shrift because of the analysis to focus on the perceived homophobia endemic into the Black community. It's just given so much more space than actually understanding the levels of care that were provided and the levels of diversity of perspectives within the Black community in terms of what they actually did rather than what they say or what they felt they couldn't say. So along those lines, I've already mentioned it, but I think the second question or concern about the text is this notion of injected versus internalized impression. So many people have heard the term internalized oppression, where Toni Morrison Bluest Eye is a paradigmatic example, where this Black character, Pecola, becomes obsessed with blue eyes and wants to inhabit the white beauty myth that's reflected in things like blue eyes and blonde hair. And some theorists within the, whatever you want to call it, critical race theory, African-centered, Afrocentric tradition, criticize the term internalized oppression, because if you internalize something, the agency is still on you to internalize it. It's still almost your fault. And they instead use the term injected oppression, which puts the onus on the person doing the injecting, the white supremacist institution that's injecting you with the poison. So if homophobia is part of the Black community, then seeing it, she literally calls it like an indigenous perspective. And I think that viewing it as an injected perspective is not only more accurate, given the levels of gender variance and diversity of perspectives on gender within the Black community, injected oppression in general is a more useful frame to understand the specific response around institutions dealing with things like public health and addiction in the Black community. So even her analysis around respectability politics, she does cite the theorist who is noted with talking about respectability politics in the context of civil rights movements in the South, but she doesn't talk about some of the nuances and reasons why respectability was seen as so important, because in the midst of literal murderous violence and frames of Black people being inhuman, it was seen as a strategic value within the context of media warfare to frame the resistance to violent white attacks on Black humanity within the frame of respectability, not because they had inherently believed that stuff, but because they thought it was a strategic utility at the time. Similarly, texts talk about the Black woman in the South operationalizing this respectability politics around lifting up charismatic Black male leaders. Many people talk about how that was a strategic opportunities at times for Black women to actually operationalize a degree of agency and power, as opposed to being paradigmatically disempowered. So many people talk about it was a strategic, intentional choice to lift up King during the 50s, because King is very young. You know, he had just come down largely from getting his PhD up north, and the idea of him being young and relatively disconnected allowed the Black indigenous networks of leadership by women in the community during the bus boycott to have more control than having a more established, older Black pastor be the face of that movement. So I think that challenging this notion of respectability politics and the inherent internalized oppression and seeing it as injected destabilizes it and allows you to see the agency in what otherwise is just paradigmatically respectability behavior. I think one thing I was surprised to see in this text is a lack of seeing the respectability and religious focus on things like abstinence and supposed to harm reduction through the lens of a critique of the culture of 12-step. 12-step is a white conceptual framework of white Christianity that essentially views addiction as a moral failing and almost a sin within the individual. So that comes out of, Big Bill, 12-step, the Big Book, embrace being helpless in the face of drugs, call upon your higher power, in a specific frame that is anathema to many forms of liberation theology. So as opposed to viewing the failing within the individual and calling upon God to liberate you as the individual, a liberation theological frame would see sin within the context of larger society being sinful. And that's also the frame many people use to understand addiction as the internalization of self-hatred and the conditions faced in the community. But so much of the culture of treatment of addiction is Black people being essentially forced within the context of the institutions that do recovery to adopt a very particular version of Christianity that's very focused on individual redemption through abstinence. And if you don't do that, you don't get funded, and just sort of seeing that as being forced onto the Black community in order to get the funding to do treatment, as opposed to it being an indigenous cultural conservatism, I think would actually strengthen the book to make that argument around 12-step culture and addiction treatment culture being this conservative religious frame. But I think she's so locked into it being an indigenous Black community framework, she doesn't see it as it being treatment culture and 12-step culture and white culture. That is that frame being forced in. And I think in addition to all these conversations, we can have a brief conversation around the idea of it being indigenous patriarchy in the Black community is challenged pretty comprehensively by African-centered scholars, not just studying ancient Africa, but Black communities' work here in America. So whether it's Chinanta Diop talking about the need for African countries to deal with the fundamental tradition of matrilineal and matriarchal societies in Africa, whether it's not just Moynihan viewing matriarchal power in the Black community as pathology, it is other cultural theorists who have studied things like Black women oftentimes working outside the home because they were able to make money working in white people's houses when Black men weren't, because the Black men in a white people's house was seen as taboo given the assumed hypersexuality of Black men. That meant that indigenously within the Black community, as a survival, Black men oftentimes spent more time raising kids and doing work typically coded as female because the woman had to be the breadwinner because those were the jobs available. And as opposed to that being read as deflated patriarchy within the Black community, those forms of care that Black men provided that are coded feminine by the white community were oftentimes celebrated. And they still are today. Studies have shown that Black men, relative to white men, spend more time doing things related to childcare. I mean, I see Black parents all the time taking their kids on the bus, right? And I think similarly, within the context of substance use norms, the bong, the water pipe, that's an African invention. So even before cannabis had arrived in Africa, African people had used water pipes to smoke other plants in Africa. And again, just different African communal relationships to intoxication. Think about Billie Holiday, think about the Flappers, think about, all of the jazz communities. Abstinence and conservative relationships to substance use is not an inherent part of the Black community. But given the particular realities, especially around crack cocaine, and the community's response to methadone, which I'm going to talk to later, these particular responses around more conservative relationships to substances are not read within the context of a larger war on drugs, or read within the context of a larger criminalization campaign of drug possession, not read as an example of a belief that the white man is putting drugs in your community because if you're high, you're an easier target of white supremacy. All of that is used basically as a genocide conspiratorial frame, as opposed to a larger community's choosing to have a different relationship to substances, but still trying to provide ways of care and on-ramps and avenue of care through the genocide frame to the folks suffering through AIDS. I think the lack of ability to engage not just African-centered theories of gender and sexuality, but also just Black vernacular community understandings of the issue in general, I think weakened the text, and it largely comes from a particular academic gaze so specifically centered on the rhetorical humanization and centering of queer bodies and drug users, that it ignores the ways in which the frames that it sees as diminishing those ability for those things to be central, try to put those things in a larger context of culture and history and violence. So, next point. When we start talking about politics, similarly, I think that the text basically is talking about what Derek Bell would call interest convergence, where Black mainstream institutions saw the ability to essentially hustle off AIDS, and their interests converged with white communities because they had to give something to Black people. And as opposed to fundamentally challenging the reality that Black people have to rely on interest convergence, period, for that survival, it essentially ends up without a ton of fleshed out conclusions on what the alternative is. Granted, it's mostly an analysis and critique. But the implication is, if there were people who represented more diverse perspectives that had firsthand experience as organizers fighting on behalf of Black queer people and Black drug users, if they were empowered more within the negotiations around the federal bills, they put money on the ground for AIDS. If they were empowered more in the fights for state resources for AIDS, we'd have better results. So we end up locking ourselves into a largely representational analysis and basically having a more diverse interest at the table so that we can have a better results from the interest convergence rather than challenging interest convergence itself being the only mechanism by which Black people can advance. So even the idea that Black folks' resistance to needle exchange. So obviously if you're using dirty needles, you can contract AIDS, also hepatitis. So the idea was, I'll give you a dirty needle, you give me a clean one. The money to do that, the federal government didn't want to give money for it because it was seen by many people, the book talks about in the Black community, but also outside the Black community, as enabling drug users, as if the threat of disease was a critical deterrent for drug use. Now, from a public health perspective, we know that if you're suffering, if you're down bad, if you're dope sick, many people are not in a position where they're thinking about the disease risk. They're thinking about their need to get rid of withdrawal symptoms, or they're fleeing from trauma in a way that the threat of disease isn't seen as so essentially imperative as the need to get away from your reality. So from a public health perspective, this is a rock-solid policy. Needle exchange. Now we give away clean needles without forcing you to exchange them. But the idea is that, well, I'm not giving you clean needles. You already got needles, so just we're going to exchange. You give me a dirty one, I give you a clean one, to get around the idea that we're just giving people needles so they can just shoot up willy-nilly. So even the idea of needle exchange, and it's not in my notes, but the idea of needle exchange tacitly accepts a degree of respectability politics. Because the public health perspective is clean needles. That's where we are now. But even the idea of advocates being so adamant about rejecting tacit demonization of drug users, but they're willing to accept needle exchange rather than clean needles as the frame. So that's kind of what I'm getting to. It's like they can strategically accept the frame sometimes, but they criticize anyone that's outside of the particular clique of people directly coming out of the drug user community from the particular perspective of harm reduction and public health as too into the pragmatic negotiations when, again, it's a dirty world, we all live within it. But I specifically wanted to talk about the idea that Black community is the reason why we didn't get needle exchange, because it gets to a political reality and political theory that I think is going to be important for our conclusions about what happens with Black Lives Matter. So Jenny Daino, in her thesis, Poe Use in Public Policy in the White House, 1993 to 2000, so this is a thesis that actually does a whole extended section on Clinton's choice to not provide federal funding for needle exchange. And it's not the Black community's resistance to it that's the core reason. So I'm just going to read you an excerpt. Quote, Congress vetoed a ban on federal funding of needle exchange programs in the late 80s. As early as 93, the CDC reviewed the results of a 700-page study and concluded that needle exchange programs, or NEPs, decreased the rate of new infection with HIV, and there was no evidence the program increased the amount of drug use. After revisiting the study, officials at the CDC concluded the ban of federal funds of NEPs should be lifted. In 97, for instance, the National Institute of Health released another in a long line of reports stating there was no longer any doubt these programs worked to prevent HIV. Through 97 to 98, this appeared to be where the administration was headed. In February 98, Shalala announced the administration had scientific evidence necessary to meet the first component of a two-pronged test. However, the president's well-respected director of national drug policy, General McCaffrey, was firmly opposed to any government subsidy. His argument echoed that of many opponents, including most conservatives and some leaders of the African-American community who argued the program amounted to tacit approval of drug use. McCaffrey wrote Sermon, a letter which stated, quote, "As a public service citizen and parent, we owe our children an unambiguous no-use message." Despite McCaffrey's opposition, the president still appeared ready to lift the bans. Through the spring, Clinton gave HHS staff, White House officials, public health experts, and AIDS activists a clear sense he was ready to move forward. In a talking points memo Shalala prepared, used during the press conference, she wrote, "The evidence is airtight. From the beginning of this effort, this has been about science, science, science." In the morning of April 20th, when Shalala and her staff were going over the last-minute details of the press conference, she received a call from Erskine Bowles, the White House chief of staff, who told her that during his flight back from South America, the president had reconsidered and decided not to fund needle exchange programs because it was, quote, too politically risky. Given the historical record and nature of opinion, however, this appeared polls played at least some role in the president's decision not to pursue federal funding. Rather than lift the ban to allow federal funding of NEPs, however, he decided merely to encourage states and localities to continue funding the programs on their own. What is interesting about this is that it reflects public opinion almost exactly, giving sway to the arguments the president used polls to help set parameters and decide what the policy should be. The studies appeared at first glance to show a majority of Americans supported needle exchange. Human Rights Campaign released data in April showing 55% support needle exchange. Kaiser showed 58 and 64% support clean needles. The studies also indicated other questions that are less reliable because of problematic wording. 1 in 6 in 10 Americans stated the decision should be left to the states and localities, not the federal government. Additional questions asked during the time period show opinion was more complicated. When respondents were asked whether they favor needle exchange to, quote, help reduce HIV, or whether they oppose the program because they send the message it's okay to use drugs, only 48% of respondents said they support the programs. Now, opposition climbed to 46%. When respondents read elements from both pro-needle exchange and anti-needle exchange arguments, supports dropped to 43%, opposition climbed to 53%. When asked specifically whether federal money should be used for the programs, only 44% said yes. When the remainder of both sides of the arguments, particularly the concern that needle exchange amounted to tacit government approval of drug use, opposition to the program was either even or outweighed support. It was not only a midterm election year, but many in the Congress, particularly the House, opposed lifting the ban, as did General McCaffrey and other members of his staff, such as Rahm Emanuel, on political grounds. End quote. I think this is important for a few reasons, because it shows that the political environment that this debate was having was rapidly changing. The coalitional politics that the author basically says had the power to do more, but chose not to because they had too much respectability politics. I think this argument shows that this particular moment, those coalitions were actually weakening substantially. We were in a new moment where polling and Dick Moore's small ball politics was the new era within the Democratic Party. And I think that's just a larger argument where black elected officials, we didn't have the independent power basis to resist the Democrats when they said no. And we didn't have the independent power basis when they said yes. So I think the more salient argument, which I don't think is engaged with the books, is that black elected officials didn't do needle exchange because the Democratic Party didn't want to do it. And when the Democratic Party wanted to do it, they did it. So with the rise of public health and Ryan White and white folks demanding more in AIDS, the Democratic Party shifted, opened some more space, and more money went through. So I think the idea, again, this idea that it's black elected officials, not the party itself, not the white capital and power at the heart of it, shows that the text is so focused on trying to link the respectability of black folks to these political outcomes, the larger systems of political power building, a grassroots base within the black community is obscured. Because again, as terrible as this decision is, it was not a ban of federal funding. It was an encouragement of state and localities to do the funding. So one could say, hey, federal funding's fickle anyway. Let a Republican get in, they're going to cut it. Let's build a broad-based coalition from the bottom up of the folks using the genocide frame, of the folks having the E. Patrick Johnson queer theory is your roommate okay relationship to homosexuality, in addition to the drug user advocates, the sex worker advocates, to put pressure on the state and local level to get the money. But the idea of just focusing so much on fighting the existing folks within the black leadership, as opposed to building from the bottom up, I think shows this deep sense of not only frustration with the black leadership class, as opposed to seeing opportunity within the black masses more comprehensively pushing back against them, but they're choosing to frame their response to the black leadership class within a particular centering of diverse experiences of identities. And also, I think critically, for today's lesson, within the context of tying itself to particular slivers of progressive white power. So in this case, the progressive white power is the public health community, and this focus on, quote, science, science, science. And one of the things that she's critical of is the perceived lack of scientific acumen within the black community. Like, there was a plant from Africa that many Afrocentrists argued was a solution to AIDS, and she's like, well, you just got caught up in your own Afrocentric hype. It wasn't a scientific analysis, as opposed to your own argument would say, I thought Afrocentrists were homophobic. Why do they even care about AIDS? They care about AIDS because they care about the black community, and as opposed to seeing that as something to work with, the text is so adamant about showing the limitations of those frames that it's rather tying itself to white progressive bases like public health than tying itself to black vernacular sources of power within the community. And I think it also obscures the political, institutional, historical reasons why the black community responded the way it did. One of the things that struck me in the text is that she said she was actually somewhat surprised, to my point, when the Urban League started talking about AIDS, and that it was largely from the perspective of co-opting the funding. I read that from the perspective of the work of Joanna Martin Elmer, who talk about the Urban League and Northern social work, and this is New York, within the context of having a choice, either building upon existing black vernacular networks of care, the sort of black caring systems through the church that had traditionally sustained black folks but controlled by black folks. But social work in the North oftentimes tied itself to white progressives who viewed the Northern migration as a threat to the health of the cities. So whether back then it was tuberculosis, but now it could just as easily be AIDS. This idea of giving services to black folks not because you care about them really, but because you view them as a vector of disease that can impact property values, can impact the health of white people and the health of the cities. That's largely a vein that much of black social work and the Urban League got sucked up in, and basically needed to engage those white networks, even with their tacitly racist, almost eugenic relationship to black folks, to get funding. So from that perspective, it actually makes perfect sense the Urban League would do exactly what they did, but she doesn't have the historical analysis to implicate, again, white power within that alliance, and almost tacitly sees folks like that caring about AIDS as if that's a political alliance worth making, when this sort of African-centered grassroots vernacular understanding of black history would show you their limitations to that alliance. I think similarly, this blind spot shows with their lack of engagement with critiques of methadone. So for many people in the black community, methadone's only mentioned once in the book, basically saying New York had methadone clinics, they could have done more. The long history of criticisms of methadone as a tool of social control using public health language goes all the way back to the 70s, goes all the way back to Vietnam vets coming home addicted to heroin because they used it to survive the trauma of war, and people like Nixon seeing that methadone would be a way to basically give them something so they weren't stealing to get their fix, and basically viewed them as criminals in the making and wanted a government-controlled supply of drugs to keep them pliant, keep them from stealing to get their street fix, dry up the demand from the street game, but treat them essentially like criminals, make them show up every day, give them liquid doses and not pills so they can't steal it easily and can't sell it easily, and just generally treat you like a prisoner, even though they're supposed to care for you. Anyone who talks to anybody in the black community knows that this is the primary experience black people have of public health and addiction. So the idea of questioning needle exchange and now safe consumption sites called overdose prevention sites is deeply because of the racialized way in which methadone was unrailed, that the book Whiteout explicitly said this was an intentional effort of racialized social control. And again, the idea that we were supposed to trust public health people, given our experience with them, especially with Reagan, especially as methadone becomes, it wasn't inherently like this. Again, New York folks who created methadone wanted it to be more wraparound services, but it became a profit-driven entity, especially over time with Reagan, privatization. It became what they call gas and go. just give people caseloads of 50, 100 people where they can't do any case management, where people are getting methadone, they may also be doing street drugs, they're not getting anything to improve their lives. And from the Black community's perspective, it's like, oh, you're making money giving them methadone, but that's really your only interest is the money you get from serving them. You don't actually do anything to improve their lives. There are no jobs, there's no trauma-informed care, there's no engagement with the larger systemic ways in which you can improve people's existence. It's just a way to get money. So it's insane that many people saw needle exchange essentially as the same thing. Public health establishment that already done methadone coming back to them now that white kids were getting AIDS, saying that we need this service for you, the Black community. So it's the Black community's understanding of that interest convergence, oftentimes not even necessarily saying, let's blow them all up, but saying, we will not accept just that. We will not accept just methadone. We will not accept just needle exchange. We are an ethnic constituency. This is America. We do ethnic politics. If y'all want to do needle exchange, we should get something in return. And that perspective is presented nowhere in this book. And I think that's far more representative of the community's understanding of the issue. Whereas, like, if you give us some jobs, you give us some investments in housing, you give us some upstream investment, maybe we can work with you on the needle exchange and the methadone and things like that. I think the last thing to state, again, is that the nature of the genocide frame being rejected as conspiracy thinking, I think it's just one of the most limiting things about this text. It almost reminds me of Michelle Alexander when she did New Jim Crow. She was a lawyer, ACLU, Black professional success, saw someone said the criminal justice system is New Jim Crow. And she said, why do we have to be so hyperbolic? You're hurting the argument. That's almost how I feel like Cohen is responding to their genocide argument, as if it is just hyperbolic analysis that people weren't serious about, that they just wanted to spin a yarn, sound radical. But I think that the grassroots resistance to crack cocaine, the community walks where people were trying to deal with crack dealing, if you read Donovan X. Ramsey's book, When Crack Was King, the government themselves said it was the Black community's demonization of crack users as detriments to community. And again, the creation of so-called stigmas around being a so-called crackhead. So it's not perfect, but that community norm or taboo was created because not just the idea that drug use was aesthetically displeasing or violated respectability politics. It was because when you had crack in your possession and you were arrested, that brought the police into the whole neighborhood. The whole neighborhood was criminalized. If you were using crack in public housing, the whole family got kicked out of public housing. If you were selling crack out of the house, you could kick in the door and grandma could get shot. So some people in the harm reduction community, I've heard them say abstinence is a form of harm reduction when you have such comprehensive levels of collateral consequences. Another big one is that if you're using crack and I'm the grandmother, they could come take the baby away from you. So this idea of demonization drug use is not inherently respectability politics. It is a recognition within a genocidal white supremacist world. Abstinence strategically can be deployed as a frame of harm reduction given the violence policing does to the community. And I think the complete dismissal of it just really, really hurts the value of the text. Because again, it's as if they just don't like drug users. They just are so high on their own supply about being upright and going to church. You got to remember, church attendance in the Black community has been declining for like 50 years. So even as this text was being written, church attendance rates were dropping in the Black community. But it's the hollowing out of the non-church political spheres of power, and specifically the radical versions of pan-africanism and Black nationalism. It's the hollowing out of those that leaves the political sphere to the more reactionary Black nationalists, more mainstream Black organizations, and the primary example of which again is not brought up in the book, is Mutulu Shakur. So Mutulu Shakur was a member of the group of people that took over the Lincoln Detox Center in New York, Lincoln Hospital, and with the Young Lords, the Puerto Rican group that basically mirrored a lot of the methodologies of Black Panthers, built a clinic that used acupuncture as an alternative to way to detox people, not just off of heroin, but also critical of methadone, detox people off of methadone, because the idea is that as a political revolutionary, you don't want the government controlling your supply, period. So in a world where the white supremacist state used public health as a way to control your body, rejecting methadone and having things like acupuncture deal with cravings for opioids was seen as a radical tool of not just healing, but also giving people a touch point for political conscientization that gave them something to live for, to reject the internalization of self-hatred and the hopelessness that drove so many people to addiction in the first place. So when Mutulu Shakur was freed before his recent passing, people tied to him talked about it was the political conscientization that was actually the most effective treatment methodology they had. They also said they weren't going to kick you out if you came in and you had used previously. So this idea that this was a pure abstinence-only respectability politics, that's just not the case. Mutulu Shakur even used destigmatizing language, didn't call people junkies, he called them drug victims. Drug victims, again, injected oppression as opposed to internalized oppression as the frame. So when Mutulu Shakur and the folks at Lincoln Detox were kicked out, it wasn't just Rockefeller and reactionary Republicans. It was part of the liberal public health establishment that said, I don't know if they're doing the best practices. They don't like methadone. Methadone is the gold standard. And what people are saying is that if Lincoln Detox methodology had worked in the podcast Dope is Death, that is a challenge to the medicalized drug system's ability and the medicalized nonprofit system's ability to make profit off of black people's suffering. So in the eyes of the people tied to Mutulu Shakur, one of the most radical things they did was decommodify the treatment addiction space through grassroots work. And that was one of the reasons why when they came for them, it wasn't just the Republicans, it was also parts of the liberal public health establishment. So again, finally, in the face of the AIDS epidemic, queer activists in Chicago actually picked up the protocol invented by Mutulu Shakur and influenced by the grassroots guerrilla care given by Mutulu Shakur, began to do acupuncture for folks suffering from AIDS. And the idea that this text is disconnected from that individual story about folks in Chicago doing it, I understand, but from the history of Mutulu Shakur, the entirety of the time period the text talks about is directly in the wake of Mutulu being arrested. So you cannot understand the political environment of black leadership and black politics in New York without talking about the wake of the violence of extracting more radical revolutionary versions of care, radical comprehensive iterations of public health, and radical Pan-African black nationalist formations. The hollowing out of that space is the context of the genocide people are trying to bring to the table when they use the genocide frame. And to see it as conspiracy theory, I think ignores, again, the reality of the conspiracies that were actually used to hollow out and deracinate the black community. And I think shows like a fundamental lack of this particular vision of black political leadership to really comprehensively grapple with the black vernacular understandings of power and politics that were so essential to build political series of leadership that would actually be effective at mobilizing the grassroots. So in conclusion, I think an example like Lori Lightfoot in Chicago is a prime example about the value of what this text provided entered an environment where it became very difficult for people to know how to operationalize the lessons of the text. And in many ways, the operationalization of the text went against what the text was hoping to do. So in Lori Lightfoot, you could read it as someone literally appointed by Rahm Emanuel, the very person who shot down the federal funding for syringe exchange, or at least was part of it, appointed her to one of her first big gigs in Chicago politics. She played up her identity politics. She had Bears tickets, she had Bulls tickets, and things like that, this sort of populist veneer, and was roundly criticized by grassroots advocates, literally some of those taught by Cathy Cohen and eventually taken out, then replaced by Brandon Johnson, a more radical black mayor. But you could also read her as, in many ways, the exact thing that this form of politics was going for. This is someone who was radicalized by seeing someone they know get a long sentence for crack cocaine, served on the board of Reproductive Freedom for All, a reproductive justice group in ACLU, also was literally a marshal in the Pride Parade, and made her bones challenging Rahm Emanuel's failure to move on police accountability. So when the activist trained by Cathy Cohen rose up to challenge her, it was some of the white queer advocates who were saying, we thought representation mattered. We thought lived experience mattered. We thought this is someone that you would want to be in office. And I think that's exactly where the difficulty of applying the lessons and the value that this text has manifested itself over the past 10, 15 years. Because you really have this form of politics becoming really the dominant, I believe, form of politics, black politics, at least engaged within the nonprofit foundation academic system over the past 20 years. So one of the primary formations of the movement for Black Lives, Black Youth Project 100, was formed in large part out of a conference that was literally in Chicago talking to Cathy Cohen when the George Zimmerman verdict came down, right? So this idea, again, of strategic focus on media power, strategic focus on shifting narratives, social media movements, in the face of digital technologies like Twitter and Facebook, which were new and hot at the time in 2013, must have truly felt like a potential to operationalize and fix what she saw as a decades-long limitation of black political leadership. But when you look at the results that came out of this era of agitation, you see more black folks in higher positions of power within the very institutions that previously were beholden to more traditional forms of black political leadership. But the results of that, many people say, is very similar to the results of the previous era of black leadership with the NAACP and Urban League having more power. It's a separation between a now more diversified, more intersectionally representative, interlocutory class of nonprofit professionals, professional advocates, and organizers, and the black masses who continue not only to experience higher rates of immiseration in terms of wealth inequality and poverty and cost of living, but specifically within the context of the text that was written, the massive, massive, massive opioid crisis and overdose crisis, particularly disproportionately impacting poor and working class black men. And now, within the theory of the text, the institutional infrastructure that's built out has to reflect the lived experience of the people who are experiencing the problem. But now that is disproportionately 45 to 70-year-old working class straight black men. So by the very theory of the text, the institutions of harm reduction and overdose care that were built up in the previous era, where the previous disproportionately impacted group was more sex workers, more queer folk, and those folks are still disproportionately impacted, don't get me wrong. But by the very theory of this book, we need to build out political infrastructure that reflects the people who are overdosing the most, which especially in places like Baltimore is poor working class black men. So there is this tension that very materially rubber hits the road, sort of saying, when we have like money from suing opioid companies, who gets the money? Who makes decisions? Who's at the table? And we have working class black organizations making the same criticism that black queer organizations and black sex working and drug user serving organizations are making in the 90s, that we have a cadre of folks who are tied to political machines and nonprofit institutions that are hoarding resources and not reflecting community. But now those institutions are the public health institutions that the advocates in the 80s and 90s strategically latched onto to try to get support for more funding for AIDS and overdose. So I think it's just really a full circle moment. And I think a moment where you can really take stock of how needed this intervention was at the time. I think people underestimate the level of trauma that must have gone into seeing this disease that no one really knew that was ever going to be a cure for. Wipe out a whole generation of working class, black, but also white drug users, sex workers, and things like that. But within that moment, the political choices that were made, tying themselves to science, tying themselves to public health, tying themselves to strategic moments of progressive white movements, the academy, the foundations, the media, reproduce a dynamic where we're still dependent upon institutions that we as black people don't control for our own survival. So I think it really is in this moment where places like Baltimore have a chance to build out, for example, responses to the overdose epidemic that really center black grassroots vernacular perspectives of things like taking the legacy of Matulu Shakur and Lincoln Detox and the work that they did tying drug use to political realities, internalized self-hatred, white supremacy, and empire and all these other things, tying things to culturally responsive theories of addiction that take into African-centered conceptions that reject internalized self-hatred. And again, those things are not exclusive to straight folks. There are Black queer individuals that, through things like the SGL movement and in Baltimore, the Amasi Center, that use some of these tools specifically for the unique conditions faced by Black same-gender loving individuals. But really centering those and tying them to more comprehensive visions of community empowerment, investing in housing and jobs and indigenous community infrastructure to meet people's economic and cultural needs. That being a response to this epidemic that reflects the genocide frame. And I think that texts like this show us that we can learn from the limitations of past responses and build upon them in ways that respect the intersectionality and diversity within the Black community, but also really center Black community control besides interest convergence, besides public health, as the center of responses to these horrible conditions, these epidemics, and really allow us to improve on the responses we had in the past. That becomes an issue, though, as we advance policies that try to build upon these responses, and that issue is a big part of the reason why I wanted to do this episode. It is that sometimes the folks who take lessons from books like this over-apply it to argue that we can't put resources in the hands of grassroots Black political formations or community formations because they're too steeped in respectability politics, they're too homophobic, they're too anti-drug user. And this is a big thing we're facing here in Baltimore now, where it's not only demanding a shift of resources, but it's not just a political movement per se to deny community resources. It's sometimes spoken or unspoken. And many people see this as a vestige of the response to concerns around the Nation of Islam and Minister Farrakhan, and specifically AIDS. That while this text, again, does not seek to totally eliminate the use of linked fate and racial politics, the academic and intellectual movements that have been spawned in part from this text, but also larger academic engagements, have oversimplified the argument to say that many Black grassroots formations are so, in the words of this text, innately or indigenously infected with these negative ideas, these conservative respectability politics ideas, that we can't trust them with resources. We can't trust them to treat people well. We can't trust them to do good services across the Black community. So rather than seeing the Black community and the contestation for resources as challenging the white nonprofit industrial complex in general, they see it again as particular segments of the Black community hustling in a way that would actually deny resources to more needy people in the Black community. And I think this is one of the critical reasons why we have to analyze the narratives coming out of these academic texts, because they have serious implications for the forms of political redistribution and institution building that are seen as desirable, that are seen as effective in the Black community. Again, given the interest convergence between elements of the largely white-controlled public health infrastructure and academic infrastructure and folks advancing these critiques, it is not surprising, and in fact it's in the interest of these institutions to overemphasize the conservative nature of Black grassroots formations to justify their control of critical resources for the community, be it harm reduction, be it violence prevention, be it public health, be it any of these, quote, again, science-based frameworks that this text, again, made a strategic alliance with in terms of the 90s and AIDS and harm reduction. But that larger frame has locked us into this dynamic where academic institutions get to use the points made in this text that we're trying to expand and diversify Black leadership to really pathologize Black leadership in general. And we need to take seriously, when respectability politics is limiting Black institutions' responses, we have to take that seriously. But we also cannot allow the negative caricatures of Black people and Black formations as inherently corrupt, as inherently not deserving of power, as inherently conservative, to prevent us from building the Black institutions we need to challenge the dynamic of interest convergence, whereby people use the pathologization of our community to benefit themselves. hope you enjoyed that analysis of The Boundaries of Blackness by Cathy Cohen. If you want more analysis of LBS's perspective on drug policy, public health, and building more comprehensive responses to conditions like overdose and drug use, go to lbsbaltimore.com, look at the publications page. You'll find the report, The Community Impacts of Drug Criminalization in Maryland, that basically is our analysis of what drug arrests did in Maryland and Baltimore to not just hurt individuals, but really hollow out communities' capacity to operate in terms of self-determination, and viewing the response to that violence of criminalization not solely within the purview of public health, but also in more comprehensive upstream political interventions to empower community, not merely as an act of social justice, but also as a politically pragmatic action to allow forms of public health, like better forms of methadone, like alternatives to traditional forms of treatment, like forms of overdose prevention centers that may receive resistance within the Black community, really viewing the Black community as something to be invested in comprehensively, as opposed to solely those forms of public health that have the interest convergence of public health establishments and fit within particular scientific conceptions of the disease model of addiction. So seeing addiction more through a grassroots community perspective of, some people call it dislocation theory, the social dislocation that comes with gentrification or the war on drugs or mass incarceration, but also just the cultural injected oppression of self-hatred driving addiction and needing specific options to fix that. So again, if you want to invest in our political work to address these conditions, please go to lbsbaltimore.com/sustain. For as little as $5 to $10 a month, you can give money that continues to allow us to operate independently and to operationalize forms of advocacy that can begin to shift the flows of resources, so we don't have to depend on interest convergence with the public health institutions to be able to advocate on these critical issues. Again, you can check out our back catalog where we've talked about some of these issues around addiction in previous episodes of In Search of Black Power. That's, of course, on Black Liberation Media. So click through our archive, click through the archive of all the other shows that are with us in the Black Liberation Media Collective. And we hope to see you next time as we continue to go in search of Black Power. See you soon.